I remember one time having a business meeting in Italy. I think we were in Milan, and it was a lunchtime, and everyone was kind of ordering by looking at what everyone else on the other tables was eating and drinking and saying, "Is that good? Is that good?" And the people on the other tables would turn around and say, "Oh, this is very good. You should have this." Ordering a bottle of wine, each having one glass and then leaving the rest on the table. And I remember thinking as a Brit, this would never happen in the UK because there's this weird thing among Brits where they don't leave alcohol on the table. So if you've ever been like in a or a pub at closing time in the UK and the bell goes or the second bell goes and people get up to leave, they will stand and as they're rising, they will finish their drink.
Hey everybody, welcome to the Decoding Cocktails podcast. I'm your host, Chris LeBeau. At the ripe age of 38, I left my former career behind and joined the hospitality industry. Since then, I've been on a rapid journey of learning, meeting all sorts of great people, and this podcast is my chance to bring you along with me, whether I'm interviewing somebody that works in the industry, another enthusiast, or occasionally stepping back to share what I'm working on or my thoughts. I'm so glad you're here, and so with that aside, let's get into today's episode. What's happening, everybody? Welcome back for another episode of the Decoding Cocktails podcast. Today I've got a great one for you, and they're all great, duh. But my conversation today is with Dr. Nicola Nice about her book, The Cocktail Parlor, How Women Brought the Cocktail Home, and it was a real delight to chat with her. The book is absolutely worth your time, and so is the conversation. If I had to give you just a few takeaways, here's what I'd say. During the first golden era of cocktails, one of the things we need to keep in mind is that bars, clubs, and pubs, etc., were often pretty much solely or primarily the domain of men. And at times, obviously, again, it was like even like women keep out, gross, maybe cooties. But so it's no surprise that many of the early cocktails, obviously, in these bars were created by men. That said, as Dr. Nicola puts it, women are the ones who brought the cocktail home, using them to entertain friends, host parties, and create spaces for community. And because the rise of the cocktail and suffrage movement were deeply intertwined, many women who were still barred from entering these places where major social and economic conversations were happening hosted events that men ended up wanting to attend. Thus, as a result, they gave themselves a seat at the table by creating a space where the men wanted to be. Dr. Nice also does a great job in our conversation kind of exploring how different waves of feminism first promoted, then killed off, and then ultimately helped resurrect the cocktail party and why. As a fun aside, before I hit record, we realized that the day of our conversation happened to fall on the anniversary of the very first recorded cocktail party, which was hosted in my city of St. Louis, Missouri. It took place in 1917 is the number, at the home of Miss Clarabelle Walsh, a home that still stands today. You can find Dr. Nicola on Instagram at Nicola, Nicola .nice, Nice, or at her website, thehostessdiaries.com. There will be a link in the bio where you can also find a link to buy the book. And I've got that for you in the show notes as well. Enjoy this conversation. So, Dr. Nicola, I remember as I delved into this book, I believe it says Robert Simonson alludes to in the foreword of the book that he was doing a lot of recapping of the history of the cocktail. And you kind of quickly swept in there to kind of talk about why the list of things that he was covering was incomplete. And I loved this idea as he kind of brought the foreword to a close that while we perhaps can think about the bar room as where cocktails may have been birthed, which was obviously historically a male-only space, and thank God for things that change, but it really was, in a way, where we think about where a lot of cocktails in this world are consumed at home, it really was, understandably then, women, the keepers of the domicile, who really brought that home and, of course, championed it in so many ways. So, what was it that, tell us a little bit about what, again, writing a book is no easy undertaking. Tell us what pain or urgency led you to want to do this in the first place.
That's a great question. And I think I have to give Robert Simonson a lot of credit here, not just for recognizing the need for these stories to be told and helping to give me a platform for those stories in the piece that he wrote about me and my research for the New York Times, but also really actively encouraging me to write the book. To your point, I think that one can have a lot of imposter syndrome coming into a topic area like this. I had a lot of moments where I thought to myself, is this just me? Do other people really not know about this? Is anyone going to care? Because a lot of the stories that I'm uncovering and the people that I'm learning about and the places where cocktails have really become a thing over the last 150 years are not typically people and places and things that get written about. And so you sort of question yourself, right? Is that because no one wants to hear the story? Worse, is that because I'm wrong about the story? And Robert was, I think, really instrumental in persuading me, absolutely, you need to tell this story.
Yeah, and I think in a way that when we've also uncovered the history of cooking, even in this country alone, that so many of the original cookbooks were written by perhaps were even written by women authors, but at times it was servants in the household who were really behind that. And so I think at times, hopefully, it's more of an unawares or that and it does really help complete the story more in that regard in terms of how did these come out there because a barman could know something but again someone championing the pedestrian language, the ability to simplify this. Because again, even to this day, it's like you find people all the time who get recipes online and they look at them and they're like, this is going to take me $300 in 3 hours to make right here. And so I think people who wanted it to feel simple and what is it to even to jump way ahead, the idea of the cocktails in the 50s and to 70s in your chapter, the idea that the cocktail came to symbolize American ingenuity, making something out of nothing resilient in the face of hardship. But this idea that hosting is something we all can do if we have a clear enough idea of where we're going.
Absolutely. I think you've hit on a really important point there that there is a big difference between hospitality and hosting. And when we go into a restaurant or a bar, we experience hospitality. We experience the industry and the business of hospitality. And there's a lot that goes along with that in terms of, what we engage with and what we expect and the type of expertise that gets passed on to us as part of that experience. Most of us who go out and eat at a Michelin star restaurant or, a bar from the top 50 bars in the world are not eating and drinking things with the intention of thinking, okay, how am I going to make this at home now? Right? We're going there specifically to have that experience. And so the world of hosting, where we make food and drinks for ourselves or to entertain others, is a totally different environment. And yes, sometimes there absolutely are those among us who, and we all know them, right, who are brilliant and create amazing experiences for their guests. But for most of us, what we're trying to do is just make people feel welcome and share something of ourselves with them and express that through the food and drink. And so, really, one of the themes that I wanted to explore in the cocktail parlor was exactly that. What are the drinks that we go back to again and again and serve each other and have done over the last 2 centuries?
So obviously, for anybody that wants the full history, they need to pick up a copy of the book, which we'll certainly link to. But what I liked, and I don't know, again, I think this was in my pre-notes that I sent over to you, but I remembered actually, of all things, in the show, Downton Abbey, that there was very much notably at the end of World War I in the show that many of the traditional walls began to break down. And in your book, you highlight as well that the end of the Great War, or however a person wants to refer to it, was this seminal moment in many things really beginning to break open. So we know that, Jerry Thomas and clearly great female hostesses were out there beforehand, but this really was a tipping point moment in history.
Absolutely. And I think from the point of view of the US in particular, of course, prohibition, which happened just 2 years after that, was so pivotal in changing the dynamics of how and why and where we host in the home. Up until that point, there were occasions, as I write about in the book, where women were starting to integrate cocktails into the way that they entertained. And importantly, they were starting to, in some places, get access to spaces where cocktails were being served. And we write about the tea dances that they went to and the cabarets and so on. But for the most part, they still weren't really being allowed to go into saloons or private bars or clubs where drinks were being served. And so prohibition was really the catalyst for them to discover those drinks. And, when anything arrives into the home and comes into the hands of women, that's when we take over because this is our domain now. And that's where women really started to have a big influence on recipes. And we see that being reflected back in the bartending guides that then got written over the next 10 or 20 years after that, including drinks like the bee's knees, for example, which, was a drink that was really popular with women, as were a lot of other gin-based drinks.
Hmm. Yeah, and I liked how even perhaps, I mean, obviously it seemed like a drink we need to talk about certainly is like the wine cup, but also that there was a period of time as well. And hey, there's always a moment maybe that so acceptable time and not for being three sheets to the wind, if you will, but also what we see in a lot of the early cocktail mixed drink history at home are drinks that are often wine based in nature, in part because it's something you can have something of maintain your faculties in an era, not that it still doesn't exist right now, where women are held to a double standard, but where for a woman to be inebriated would have been seen as, not lacking decorum or whatever the right term is. And so these things were made, but they were also lower proof libations as well, too.
Absolutely. And I think the wine cup in particular, I feel, is a category of cocktail that has really been excluded from the way that we talk about the history of the cocktail. Perhaps because it was a wine-based drink and rather than, a spirits-based drink, like, going from the punch to the cocktail. But it's really important to remember just like how big this drink was for people. I mean, it would literally was what people were serving all the time. And I personally think, as I say in the book, my theory is that over the course of history, any drink that has been really adopted en masse by women tends to have been drinks that get dismissed as not proper drinks. And
Mm.
we've seen that over and over again. And the wine cup, I think, is very much a victim of that. And yet, it's such a great drink. To your point, I mean, if you are drinking in the afternoon, in the daytime, drinking over a period of time, wanting to measure and control how much you're drinking, the typical wine cup is sort of 5 to 7% ABV. So it's very sessionable and very easy to control, not to mention delicious.
And I think to that end, to anchor for people who need to buy the book right now, that that the wine cup, the best way to think about this is in our modern day parlance is sangria as well. So at times we have, certain, often probably drier wines mixed with various fruit juices and other things like that. And obviously, sometimes you have your sangria spiked with a little bit of brandy or something like that. But yeah, at the end of the day, what we have is a low proof, oftentimes bittersweet wine drink is what we're looking at right there.
Absolutely. And, the practice of mixing wine with herbs and honey and, fruits and so on goes all the way back to the Romans, right? It's not like it was invented then. But to your point, I've done this experiment at events where I've made the same drink, a wine cup, and served it to people, and people have kind of said, I don't know what this is. And then when I've called it a sangria, they get it instantly and immediately start drinking it. So this is,
Yes.
I mean, in the end, it's yes, you can say that they are distinctively different drinks, but when it comes down to what's popular, a lot of it is just semantics.
And, you know, again, I think there was a dark period in American culinary history too, and we're reclaiming some of that right now. I think and to what women hostesses of then may know that we all need to recapture now is okay, yeah, if you have a dry wine and some fruit juice, you do need those bitter herbs or whatever to help balance that out. Because again, I think part of the whole reaction, the word cocktail is such this broad catch-all where it's like, is it a well-made drink? Is it a sugar bomb? And our ability to dry it out with bitters or bitter herbs is the thing that also again makes it refreshing and palatable as opposed to a thing you're more enduring at that point in time.
Think so, but I very much come at it from the point of view of, it's not my role to be the cocktail police and tell
Fair enough.
people, the way they like to drink something is wrong or not correct or not as good as the way someone else might approach that same drink. And when I first actually conceived the structure for the cocktail parlor, I initially just wanted to write about the periods of time where the cocktail has kind of gone through its major waves of popularity. So, obviously Jerry Thomas's era, Prohibition, the recent craft cocktail revival, when cocktails have really been, very much part of like the mass. And even if I look back at like the original proposal that I wrote, I kind of left out like a big period in the middle. And as I was writing the book and researching the book, I had this exact thought where I thought, why would I just leave out a period of time? And obviously, people were mixing drinks, people were having cocktails. We might look back on it as saying, oh my God, they were too sweet or this or that, but they were still what everyone was drinking. And I felt like it was my job to really just tell the story of how things have evolved and look for kind of common themes throughout the centuries of drinking, as opposed to calling out one period or another as saying this was a good period or a bad period. Certainly, there have been periods of time that have been more inventive than others, and there have been periods of time that have been more culinary focused than others. But to me, each era is equally fascinating. And actually, going into the sort of so-called dark ages of the cocktail, I found sociologically some of the most interesting
Hmm.
areas to research.
Yeah, and no, thank you for pulling me back on that. I certainly didn't intend for that to be like a cocktail police kind of thing as much as sometimes I wonder if, again, people having had if sangria is to this or that, if that can lead to some of that downfall. But it could also be, again, that this isn't a serious drink or whatnot. So some of it could just be perception based.
Yeah.
And yeah, so I think you're right. Always like to think of it when people are curious, showing them the levers to pull to adjust a drink. But at the end of the day, you should like what you like. So yeah, I
Yes.
didn't mean to come in there and weigh judgment on that.
Yeah. I think a really funny example of that is actually the martini, right? So the martini being ostensibly a two-ingredient cocktail that really comes down to ratios and how it's prepared, right? Shaken or stirred. And I really love that as an example because everyone will have their own opinion on what that ratio is and how they like it to be served. Is it a twist? Is it an olive? Could it be both? I ordered a martini the other day with an olive and a twist because I was just in the mood for both. But it was so funny how the other people around me were like, really, both? Why? And the only reason why was because at that precise moment in time, I was just craving both of those flavors, in the context of the drink. And I'm also someone who really loves the taste of vermouth. So I really like drinking 50-50 martinis and I like drinking reverse martinis. And that means that also I know I can order two of them and be pretty safe and continue drinking and enjoying drinking. But it is funny how people get really upset about that. And it's very personal.
You're right. It is. And of all of many of the cocktails, I think the martini is the most personal. And I remember at one point in time, I was coming out of a cocktail event and went to a great restaurant here in town and had a talked to the bartender. We worded up a 50-50 martini. And I just remember I took my first sip and I go, right now, at this moment, this is the best cocktail in the world. Because again, it was because that was what spoke to me in that moment right there.
Right, right.
So I think another thing that was useful in the book to hear, one, going back to Prohibition real quick, I loved the idea of the tea parties and the tea dances and whatnot, and that during Prohibition, at times there wasn't necessarily tea in the teapot. I loved the idea of it being this like subversive thing. But another thing that I think was useful was as we think about the movement of women staking a claim, wanting to stake a claim more in their rightful place in society,
Mm.
you know, it's tied to, suffrage even more as like a larger women's liberation movement, so to speak. And I liked the idea of, okay, we can't get into the clubs of these men. And so we need to make it so that our parties are just irresistible where they want to be. So the first thing was rather than break into their space. So, like, tell us a little bit about what you uncovered with that, because I thought that part was so clever in terms of like, don't try to climb the castle wall. See if you can get somebody out of there.
Yes, I mean, this to me, this was like a massive eureka moment when I kind of made that connection. And a lot of it actually was triggered by just a desire to sort of understand how the cocktail party started, because I knew that it couldn't have started with prohibition. There aren't really any kind of social behaviors that just happen overnight. They can be catalyzed by something, but it had to have been there in some form already. Equally, on the other side, I was interested how the cocktail party fell out of favor, which we can maybe talk about as well later. So I really wanted to dig into what were some of the behaviors that might have been already there among women that would have enabled them to so quickly grab on to cocktails and sort of invent this sort of new tradition of a 5 to 7 type drink focused social hour that wasn't lunch and wasn't dinner and kind of had this purpose of loosening people up and just having, let's just say, like more casual ways of interaction, because dinners can be extremely formal, right, as we know, even at that period of time. So I started to see a lot of parallels between tea and cocktails. So I already knew that the tea party in its original form of a sort of women only late afternoon, tea and light snack type moment had started originally because women were not allowed in coffee shops. So coffee shops back in the 18th century were seen as places where men went to philosophize and discuss the latest politics of the day, and these topics and issues were seen as beneath women. And so women started drinking tea instead and started to, creating their own occasion for that. And so naturally, they already had this occasion that they owned. As you know, talking about things, shows like Downton Abbey and, of course, the sister show, The Gilded Age, we can think about visually these moments of these very uptight ladies sitting around with their pinkies out sipping tea, and for the most part among the upper classes for much of the 19th century that's what tea parties look like. But as we know, around the turn of the 20th century we have a whole new generation of women emerging who are aligning themselves with the suffrage movement, are frustrated by not just social occasions, but the entire world being divided into public and private, male and female, and their exclusion from those private worlds where all decisions that affect them and their families and their futures are made without them. And so this extends not just into the world of work and politics, but also into the softer world, the softer social world. And so women started to use the tea occasion as an occasion for them to have some of these conversations, right? And so we know, for example, in the UK, that tea shops around the turn of the 20th century were some of the first businesses that women could legally own and operate. Same in the US. So, in the beginning of the 20th century, we see the emergence of tea rooms and women operating tea rooms, and these becoming places where women feel comfortable going out of the house without men, as well as coming to meet even politically, yes, to discuss topics of the day. But to your point, there's still one problem with that, right? It's still outside where decisions are being made. And so throughout history, women have had to create spaces and invite men in, and they've seen more progress and success through that before they've been able to infiltrate and eventually conquer the male dominated spaces. And so at these tea parties, to as you said, they were not only looking for a place to have these types of conversations, but also these were very acceptable places socially for women to be unchaperoned and to be by themselves without a male escort. And so the rules were totally different. It was way more liberating. It was also a lot cheaper to have a tea party than it was to put on a lunch or dinner. You don't need maids for this, right? Anyone can serve tea and little bites. So the only thing that was missing was men. And so women did start using the tea party as a more social occasion, a more relaxed, casual social occasion, and they started to serve cocktails, and in particular the wine cup, at these occasions. And they started to invite men to join them. And with the offer of alcohol, men quickly agreed, as well as a room full of single women, right, who wouldn't agree. And this became such a thing that these tea parties then became, as I mentioned earlier, tea dances. And these would be held in big hotels in places like New York City. Again, a socially acceptable way for men and women to mix and mingle together. And one other thing that was also important for the emergence of tea dances and alcohol and cocktails was the tango. So the tango also arrived on the scene around the same time. So you've got women, cocktails, men dancing, and this was the precursor to the cocktail party.
Hmm. You know, I appreciate you kind of touching on that again. That's great. Yeah, but I think like this idea of how that slowly kind of one, I thought it was cool that there's a cocktail even called the suffragette and just the other things. So tell us about this. So like obviously cocktail's been around for a while and whatnot. So we can't get past this moment based on when this conversation is happening. So 108 years ago today, on April 17th in 1917, in the great city of St. Louis, where I'm fortunate to be sitting right now, Ms. Clarabelle Walsh hosted what is considered to be the first ever recorded cocktail party. Do you mind walking us through what, again, doesn't mean something hadn't happened before. This is the first one we're aware of. Tell us for you and for so many historical scholars, what makes this moment the first of its kind?
So, to your point, I think one of the things that is always going to be impossible to pinpoint is exactly when was the very first cocktail party held. What we do know about this particular event that was held on that day was it was called a cocktail party, and the type of occasion that it was styled as a new sort of social occasion. And specifically, there were some social behaviors, if you like, at this event that were very different from if you look at sort of Victorian era socializing and entertaining, because this wasn't even a tea party. This wasn't a tea reception. It wasn't a lunch. It wasn't a dinner. It wasn't a pre-dinner event. It was an afternoon event. It was actually on a Sunday, and it
After
was
church, I believe.
post church. But the point of it being that it was an event where people gathered specifically to share a cocktail together. So a cocktail party, as opposed to, say, a tea party or a tea reception. So the purpose of the event was to drink cocktails together. It was also very much a co-ed event. So men and women attended this event together. A bartender was actually hired to tend bar at the event and serve types of cocktails like I think they mentioned in the article, the clover leaf and the Bronx and others. So cocktails that were commonly being served, not usually in home type events like this, but very common in bars and clubs being served at this event. And the other thing that I found really intriguing about the way the newspaper article described the event is that people were standing up. And if you think about cocktail party now, we kind of take for granted that we're going to be standing, right?
Mm.
And I think usually when you sort of look at etiquette books, the recommendation is usually that there should be seating for about a third of the people that you're expecting, and the rest are expected to stand. And there might be some rotating between someone sitting and someone standing and so on, but primarily we expect to stand. This is completely different to any type of party that we might have attended before, right? Even a tea party, there would be an expectation that there would be seating. The seating might be spread out, or if you were at a tea dance, that you would be sat around tables and so on. But here we're very specifically standing together and having a cocktail together. And so I think we can look back on the way this event and the way that it was described and say that it was the most recognizable form of the cocktail party that by the time we get to the 50s just becomes the way we entertain and is now very much ingrained in the sort of calendar of types of events that we might attend in a typical social calendar.
I I think yeah, so I think the way you said this now was really useful for me in terms of we had oftentimes these wine-based drinks or punches that women were serving in the home, and they were bringing the bee's knees and other cocktails into the home, the martini, etc. But what we had now in this very public format was drinks that were often found in saloons or clubs being served
That's
in the
right.
home in a public informal format where again, this is not a seated event. This is a casual mix and mingle thing, which was, again, another popular thing we see coming up. And I wanted to talk about too of this idea that as you had these grand hostesses emerge at some point in time, a lot of this was this idea of bringing together these extremely unusual crowds, as opposed to this being solely an upper class affair. And particularly, I've forgotten her name. There was a woman in Harlem who I'm sure you can name for us, but she was also famous for again, belonging to a secondary class herself. She
Mhm.
was famous for also hosting all sorts of different LGBTQ plus people. And so anyway, so the cocktail party after we have it now is about bringing together interesting mixes of artists and patrons and whatever for just a grand soiree.
Absolutely. And I think that's what I love about the metaphor of the cocktail. As you said earlier, that it's taking multiple elements and making something greater than the sum of its parts and mixing things that might otherwise not usually go together. And I think that it became such a metaphor for the way Americans viewed themselves as hosts as well. And, even sort of comparing the way Americans might host to other cultures, that it should be this warm and inviting mix of people. And again, to the point about women finding spaces for themselves to be able to have any kind of influence because it would still be a long time before they'd have an actual seat at the table. But what they could do was host events where they could invite people that mattered. And when there are women in the room, usually what you find is a slightly more decorous atmosphere, people more social, people more willing to engage, especially when it's being facilitated by a female host.
Hmm hmm Yeah, and then I guess we also roll from there into that era of, again, post World War II, the the woman as the caretaker, the man as the working person, and so she's playing the domestic all day. And then we get into things like the era of the little black dress and cocktail attire from Coco Chanel and Christian Dior, and this idea that again, clearly, it's like, what was it? Brene Brown even has this line about some perfume that's like, do it all and make it look effortless or whatever, and she's like, I don't know if that sold perfume, but I'm sure it sold a lot of antidepressants. But in this era of cocktail attire and this idea of American ingenuity, despite what could have been happening on the inside, the idea that in this very complex, busy working world we have, this idea that cocktail attire and the cocktail party continued to grow up in terms of something you could throw on very quickly, have a couple of accessories, mix a couple of simple things into it, and now we have a post-work cocktail party or whatnot. Am I summarizing that well in the evolution at all, or how am I doing
Yeah,
here?
absolutely. One of the things that I always find so fun about the cocktail and writing about and being in this space is that it is the only drink that we dress up for. Right. So think about this. There's not beer attire. There isn't even wine attire. There's not coffee attire. There is, aside from maybe a barbecue, there are not other specific meals that we put specific clothes on and behave a specific way because of what's being served. And so I think that's why the cocktail is so evocative and so symbolic. And to your point, in the 50s, that's when it really reached its peak. And just as women were sort of learning about, the way to play all of these different roles in the home, they had to be able to transition quickly from the role of mother to wife to this to that. And of course, the dresses and what they were serving was a way to help them transition into that. And so, I always kind of say to people, think about pictures of your parents or your grandparents, depending on how old you were, who were hosting and entertaining during that time. And a lot of times these parties were just held in their home and their living room or in their basement. But I bet you, for the vast majority of people who still have those pictures, I bet your parents were really dressed up. And I bet everyone else was really dressed up as well. And today, I don't think being invited to someone's house for drinks, we would dress up in a Christian Dior style dress, right? Or a tux or what have you. So the cocktail became sort of really symbolic, not only of this really important window, by the way, between the work world and the social world, right? That's the purpose of the cocktail hour, is to transition us from one into the other, but also to, with the cocktail, transition us emotionally and, help loosen us up and so on. And create this event that is really worth dressing up for and doesn't require the formality and skill and expense of a dinner, doesn't require the boringness of a work, do. It's something in between. And we still have that today. I mean, even though we don't go to each other's houses dressed up like 50s, housewives anymore, when we do get an invitation to any kind of event where it says cocktail attire, we all know what that means. We know it means dress a little fun, dress a little flirty. We don't have to be fully formal. We don't have to be, in tuxes either. It's something in between. And I love how that continues to be so evocative.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So we're sitting here right now in what some call the second golden age of the cocktail, or however you want to look at it. But you mentioned also the cocktail party for a little while falling out of favor. Where are we at in the swing of things from the fashionability of the cocktail party? I certainly want to talk about NA drinks and sobriety and whatnot. But talk to us about where we are in the arc of things right now.
So it's funny because where I think that first wave feminism really enabled the cocktail party, it was second wave feminism that killed it, right? So we were just talking about the 50s. We were talking about the pressure on women at this time to play all of these different roles, the role of, mother, wife, housekeeper, hostess, and so on. But the one role she was not credited for and given respect for was breadwinner, right? And career. So, of course, we have in the 60s and 70s the equal rights movement, which on the one hand was about, women having opportunities to work and most importantly being paid equally for those opportunities. We still fight that today. But the other was for women not to have their entire identity defined by, their otherness to their husbands. And so what you had with that was a rejection in general of these very strict gender divisions between what men and women did in the home, and we see the emergence of more kind of co-ed hosting, less of this sort of formal come and the host is going to take care of your every need. And now we've got just sort of more casual house parties where you bring your own booze and you make your own drinks, and there's an open bar, and the hostess is hopefully having as much fun as her guests are. So that sort of, I think, the cocktail party per se fell out of favor because it was very much associated with that, the outdated 50s view of entertaining, but within that, the relationship between the sexes in the context of entertaining. It never went away. Um, I think even today, I think that, as I was saying earlier, if we get invited to a cocktail party, we know that what that means. But primarily, most cocktail parties now are going to be sort of more, maybe more formal events. It could be to celebrate a birthday or something, or any kind of occasion where you might want to have more people there and not have to put on a whole dinner, but still feel celebratory and still feel like you're gathering people together for something that is not necessarily a commitment to the whole evening. Or for a publicity event, they're still very popular in the corporate world for the same sorts of reasons, that it's not a commitment to like a full sit down dinner, and it also still guarantees an atmosphere that's a little bit more playful and social and so on. I think that people still have drink cocktails in the home. They still invite people over for drinks in the home. We still have happy hours and so on. I think even post-COVID, during COVID, we learned new ways to connect. We learned the importance of connection, even if we couldn't be in the physical presence of people who we loved and cared about. We all started having Zoom happy hours, right? We became comfortable drinking remotely together. And obviously, when the restrictions were lifted, a lot of that behavior continued. People still wanted to have these kind of intimate moments with people together. What we kind of saw in the 90s was, when really the sort of cocktail revival was just starting. But certainly we had a very empowered female during this time. Like, third wave feminism basically encouraged women to do everything men did, including drinking, including, you know, chasing after careers, chasing after sex, chasing after money, and so on. And we had sort of the emergence of a lot of themed drinking, I think, different bars being themed with different styles of drink, and a lot of that kind of carrying through to how people were hosting at home. So, you might have kind of a fiesta themed party where you'd serve margaritas, or maybe you'd have a karaoke themed party where you'd serve lychee martinis, right? So drinks start to become closely associated with the theme of how we host. I think we've kind of gone through that era again, right? And now we're in an era where it is very much, I think, more personal, and it's about, a drink or a moment that kind of symbolizes who you are as a person and what you enjoy and what you want to share with someone. And, I think that in general, gatherings are a lot more informal in the current moment in time. But we have at the same time kind of had this bifurcation in a way between mixology going really, really, really far to the point where I think a lot of people are almost intimidated by cocktails. And then you have the sort of anti-movement where people are drinking like canned seltzers and so on, which is sort of the opposite of great, as we were saying earlier, really good quality, well mixed drink. So it is interesting the way things kind of go in a pendulum.
Hmm. Yeah, it really is. And thank you for drawing that whole thing out. And I like this idea that, yeah, in order to fully move into the work world, you must also say what you are not then at that point. It is this active rejection of the thing.
Right.
And I remember hearing this, and so forgive me, listeners, if any of this is dated, but I remember many, many years ago when I was dating someone, and there was this conversation about that, yeah, with some of the roles having become more muddied, it was like in a relationship at times, not that tasks can't be split, but couples sometimes maybe need to sit down and think about like, oh, what are my roles in this relationship and whatnot. And while she's very helpful, my girlfriend would probably acknowledge that I'm slightly more the domestic one in the relationship. We had a dinner party last week, and I ran point on that. But hey, when there's a construction project in the house, we got her on the miter saw. So I think these things are, yeah, one, you have to figure out what's important. Do you want to host? But I think and then the idea that, yeah, I think that is the other problem about this era of mixology is like if you're comparing yourself to the 50 best bars, you're always going to feel inadequate. But really, a well-intended, well-made cocktail, people are going to be delighted you offered it to them in the first place, right there.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that, one of the themes that really stuck out at me over the generations of how we've served cocktails in the home is the way that the drinks that are sort of tend to endure are the ones that are A, very simple, B, like bulletproof, right? So we talk about drinks like the Negroni being a bulletproof cocktail because it's really hard to mess up. You can change out the ingredients, you can do different proportions, and it's still probably going to taste pretty good. But the other is something that is easy to vary in a way. So if you think about, I don't know, the example of the bee's knees, that classic sour template, you can use honey syrup, but then you could also make a raspberry syrup or you could make a thyme infused syrup. And before you know it, you have a drink that you already know is going to work going in, but you've put your own spin on it. And so now it's your drink. And it doesn't matter if it has a name in a bartending guide somewhere. To all intents and purposes, to you, you've created a drink. And when people come and they share that with you, that's a really special moment and a talking point that you have made something that is personal to you that you want to share with them.
Hmm. So one of the things you called out that I like in terms of maybe talking about this present moment a little bit is you said roughly since the 1980s, we've known that about a third of adults do not consume alcohol. And one of the things that I think is important about this moment is the normalization of like, you're not drinking? Why? Nope, that doesn't matter. It's like, okay, cool. Like, and that we're getting better at NA drinks, and you take time to talk about what we can kind of know to bring forward to make NA drinks taste better. And shoot, you want water or club soda or it doesn't matter. So I think that normalization is important. And I think we also, the other thing about this moment that always stands out to me is because alcohol is not without a wake of damage for some people, I think as it becomes better to talk about this sober life, I think as people become more open, I feel like it suddenly feels like it is everywhere. And it's important that, again, people can vent their frustrations, but knowing that again, 33% ish of Americans or whatever, some third of Americans have not drank for since the 80s. Where do you feel like we are in the rise of the NA movement, or in terms of, hey, things might not keep rising, but we'll level off, but there won't be stigma. Like so how do you think about where we are with respect to things?
I think we have to look at the things that we know to be true, right? So we know that as you said, 1 in 3 people don't consume alcohol at all, and 1 in 2 people of drinking age consume alcohol once a month or less, right? So that's actually a figure that has remained very consistent, as you said, since really the 80s. So that we know to be true. In any room that you go into, for any occasion, you know that at least one in three, if not more like one in two, probably don't want to drink, right? So that's the first thing. The second thing is that you can never have drinking without also not drinking, right? Because it is a binary decision. You can drink or you can not drink, right? I know there's zebra striping where you can do a bit of both, but all you're really doing there is moderating your drinking, right? You've still made the decision to drink. And that is always going to be the case, right? What I find sort of a bit short-sighted about the discussions around this area as if it's suddenly new. It's not. Like from the very invention of alcohol, there were rules about when you could drink and when you couldn't. And there are people who drink and people who don't. And that's the tension between those that causes all of the problems. The other thing that causes the problem is, of course, the extremes. So problem drinking is always a problem. It doesn't matter how many people have a problem with drinking, where you have, alcoholism or, a health issue related with alcohol. There's no amount of alcohol that's good, right? But the vast majority of people kind of sit somewhere in between where, they have, and it takes a lifetime, I think, to develop a responsible and healthy relationship with alcohol, understanding the moments when you should, moments when you shouldn't, which of those are kind of socially and culturally driven and which of those are personally driven. And to your point, it's less about it's more about accepting that that is true than it is about putting judgment on it. So normalizing the fact that it is always binary. You can or you can't, and there should be options and there should be help for people who are not able to help themselves, right? I mean, if there's one thing that we should be looking to rule out, it's problem drinking. Like, that it's anyone who has, a dependency on alcohol, and that's taking it into a totally different place. Now, of course, the issue that we have is where do we draw the line? How do we decide when it is or it isn't, right? Um, no, but for the most part, we all, we have free will for a reason. And, I think going back to the point I made earlier, that for as long as we are a society that is focused around task-oriented success, progress, work, and all of those things that go with it, we also need desperately to be able to define when we are not that. And, historically, going back millennia or for however long humans have had a relationship with alcohol or any of the other vices, usually those endure because they help make that transition. Help make that transition socially. They help make that transition in the brain chemistry. We can't be all work and no play all the time.
Oh, I had the chance several years ago to interview Dr. Edward Slingerland, and he wrote a book
Oh,
called
yes, I love his book. Yeah.
that book is so great. But I
Yeah.
think he also talks about even like the northern versus, I think his line is the northern versus southern European delineation, which the
Mm,
northern piece carries over to America. And in your book, you talk about the idea that, like, at least as was noted by somebody during Prohibition, when drinking went underground, like it descended into greater chaos. And
mm.
when it's not like in our society that you should be like, you can't drink, you can't drink, you can't drink, you can't drink. Okay, go. It's like this idea that the normalization of it as this thing that is a part of daily life, as opposed to, and hey, there's probably nothing wrong with having a few, one too many every once in a while. But I think this idea that it's more, I remember I heard a bartender speak of wine in France. He goes, it's like a grocery. You know, it's a staple in the cabinet as opposed to this like, should we break out? And it's okay to love it. You can love the crackers in your pantry too. But I think this idea that by normalizing it, that it's great for these purposes, but like with anything, too much of anything is usually not going to be so wonderful.
That's right. Yeah, absolutely. And it's funny as you were talking there, you kind of put me in mind of, three scenarios in my life where I've become very aware of my own sort of social values around drinking, right? So I'm British, right? And I think for most people who are British, I live in the US. I've been here for 18 years now, but I still very much feel, obviously, I'm British on the inside, but most British people will tell you they kind of have a foot in Europe and a foot in the US. You feel like you're impacted and influenced by both cultures. Now, I've done business all over the world and I've observed people drinking all over the world. And I've also observed, of course, myself in these scenarios. And so I remember one time having a business meeting in Italy. I think we were in Milan and it was a lunchtime. And everyone was kind of ordering by looking at what everyone else on the other tables was eating and drinking and saying, is that good? Is that good? And the people on the other tables would turn around and say, oh, this is very good. You should have this. Ordering a bottle of wine, each having one glass and then leaving the rest on the table. And I remember thinking as a Brit, this would never happen in the UK because there's this weird thing among Brits where they don't leave alcohol on the table. So if you've ever been like in a bar or a pub at closing time in the UK and the bell goes or the second bell goes and people get up to leave, they will stand and as they're rising, they will finish their drink, right? So even though they're leaving, they're no longer sitting and socializing anymore. There's just a cultural thing that you don't leave leftover alcohol on the table. Whereas, of course, in Italy, you don't drink a bottle of wine at lunchtime. You don't need to, right? And then the next scenario coming over to the US, when I first moved over here, and I remember going out for a business lunch, and this was a celebratory lunch. A deal had been done. It was a kind of a big moment. And I remember ordering a glass of champagne, right? Because it felt like this moment needed to be celebrated. And looking around the table, I was the only one who ordered, right? And sort of then in that moment, instantly feeling awkward that I was the only one at the table, even though it was a celebratory occasion, having a single glass of champagne. So it's interesting how you can just put yourself in different cultural scenarios and feel the pressure both ways, right? To drink more, to not to drink, to participate or not participate. It's fascinating.
Yeah, and all these words we throw around these days, like mindfulness and awareness, is like, yeah, this idea that there are these embedded cultural norms, and we just have to be aware of ourselves within the context of them.
Yeah. Yeah.
We have covered so much awesome ground. I really loved the book, but like this has just been even more rich right here. Is there anything we haven't? We will obviously link to you and to the book, but is there anything we haven't covered today you'd like to talk about?
Oh boy. I think we've covered a lot of really fun ground and you've hit on all of my favorite topics, and it's been a really fun conversation.
Well, that's wonderful. Well, thanks for taking a little time out of your happy anniversary of the cocktail party. And thanks so much for taking the time today. I really appreciate it.
Thanks so much for having me, Chris. It's great to meet you.
Hey, everybody. Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed today's episode, I'd love it if you'd write us a review on whatever platform you listen on or share an episode with a friend. The show notes are available at decodingcocktails.com/podcast. Happy cocktailing, everybody.